we were discussing it before we started recording, but it's worth mentioning, I think, before we dive further into the plays, that like, and it's kind of an inconvenient thing for people that are trying to like, you know, Bohemian Grove pill like normies, you know, is if you look it up and, you know, if you look up the history, it really wasn't started by like high bourgeois businessmen, and it
not
evolved over
nearly
time.
people on the scale that are like now involved in it or have been. You know?
Exactly,
Yeah.
which kind of gives them a little bit of cover because they can say, look, like this was started by a bunch of artists. Now, it's kind of a complicated story, but it's not that complicated actually how that developed. Basically, you had a bunch of kind of like artists and journalists and writers in San Francisco in the early 1870s that founded the Bohemian Club, and they really did mean that. I think a lot of these guys had traveled to Europe and like hung out in Paris and stuff.
Yeah,
and they were very enamored with the kind of like European cafe culture, and
which
that
was
around the
as
time
Bohemianism.
Yeah,
because,
like we still use it today, like as a kind of a perennially broke, you know, living on the edge, like living by their passion kind of artist person.
Yeah, the idea was it was believed that like Romani people like were from Bohemia, like that was their origin, in the same way that like the idea of gypsies is because they were thought to be from Egypt, like you know, so that's where like Bohemia, like I guess the French had some notion that Romani came from to France through Bohemia, and then so that association was why, you know, Bohemian came to symbolize people, you know, who were kind of living on the fringes of polite society or normal society.
Yeah. So this almost sounded like, you know, I mean, it almost sounds like something that would have come about more in like the 1960s with like people that maybe had some eclectic beliefs and like they were very artistic and kind of interested in like the arts broadly defined. And that's where these original kind of traditions did spring from, is they were putting on plays for each other in this kind of secluded environment up in I think originally they were in Muir Woods, and then they moved a little like further down the Russian River in Sonoma County. And you know, early on, I think there was like most of the famous people that you would associate with Bohemian Grove were, I don't know, people like Mark Twain or
Jack London was like
Jack
a very
London,
early member.
very big member, kind of an interesting guy because he's like sort of was a socialist, but then was hanging out with all these rich people. Like, I mean, you can kind of see like the weird like contradictions there with somebody like Jack London. It'd be interesting to go deeper into him one day, but yeah, and like Harry Edwards, I think, was like a founding member who was an English stage actor. But then they kind of ran into a problem after, I think, maybe the first, you know, decade or two, where these were all artists who didn't have money.
Or not
you
enough
know, by
to
nature
do
of their
these
professions.
elaborate plays, or make this like sustainable. Yeah.
So they made a kind of a significant decision in the late 1800s to start inviting wealthy business people, because by that point they had sort of accrued some clout and prestige, and they were a cool club, and the richest people, the robber barons of San Francisco, you know, we're talking about like the Stanfords, the Crockers, people like that. They all kind of wanted to get in on the action because, you know, especially back then, like social clubs were immensely important. They still are to some extent, but things like the Pacific Union Club in San Francisco is like one of the most elite institution. Then you go back to New York, you have like the Knickerbocker Club and, you know, different groups like that. And so they decided, you know what, why don't we let in, at first I think they let in some businessmen if they also had like an artistic talent.
The
that
Bohemian
they could, you know,
spirit, like
and the Bohemian
that was
spirit.
the original big criterion, that you had to have like the Bohemian spirit, but that started to like relax heavily. Like there's that book by William Domhoff from the 70s, which is called The Bohemian Grove and Other Retreats.
Really
he
good
writes,
book.
Originally being a good bohemian was supposed to require even more than participation and appreciation. It was having the carefree, unconventional spirit of the vagabond or struggling artist. It was a way of quote-unquote being. Specifically, it was being like the mythical bohemian artist celebrated in American letters since the middle of the 19th century. Indeed, the origins of the Bohemian Club can be traced directly to this romantic literary and cultural current, for the club's founders were much taken with its major figures in their writings. So, as he writes, Bohemian as a name for the unkempt, half-starving artist who is creative in spite of his dire circumstances comes from the centuries-old French folk belief that European gypsies were originally from the country of Bohemia. American artists, blah, 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 talks about, Parisian bohemianism and its influence there. So, yeah, that was, originally, and that was kind of the idea of it at first, but, over time, they're like, we gotta relax this because we don't have enough capital, right?
And then they did get enough capital, and really around the turn of the century and going in up through maybe the 1930s, you start to get a real shift, and it becomes much more secretive because it wasn't a super secret society when all these artists started in the 1870s. It was private, but I think they were much more open to inviting guests and kind of letting other people come. And then once it got all these rich men, up in it, then it became more like a traditional Pacific Union Club where only the most exclusive individuals were permitted. And that was kind of around the period where Jack London joined, was around the turn of the century. And, there still were prominent artists. I mean, there still is today. I mean, we've talked before about how two of the members of the Grateful Dead are Bohemian Grove members. And Bob Weir is talked about, it's just cool to kick back at the campfire with the general and former CIA director and just chop it up, man.
Yeah. Right.
So it's that. So even that is kind of it kind of makes sense that Bob Weir would be a Bohemian Grove member because, as Domhoff describes in his book, there still is a kind of contingent of Bohemian Grove members who are artists who don't have to pay the very exorbitant, I think it's $25,000 a year. And it's a 15-year waiting list and stuff like that. But artists and celebrities, notable people, can basically go there sort of for free, but then often they have to perform, and it's considered extremely. It's basically cause for getting disinvited or kicked out if you ever ask for money to perform music or something like that at the Grove. So you could see Bob Weir is probably jamming up there with his musician buddies and stuff for the entertainment. I mean, he probably has a decent amount of money, but it's people like that. So not every single but it still has that fundamental sort of dialectic of bringing after it kind of morphed into this thing where there were all these wealthy businessmen that came to dominate it, they didn't kick out all the artists. Artists and those types of people, creative type people that really did embody the Bohemian spirit in its original incarnation were still going there, but because it became such a pricey affair, they were cut certain breaks. And then so the culture, and it seems like it's kind of that way to this day, is the businessmen go there to rub elbows with really talented artistic people and kind of hope that some of that rubs off on them in some kind of way, some of their wild bohemian genius rubs off on them, and then the artist gets to go to one of the most exclusive men's summer retreats in the world and gets to hang out with all these powerful people and everything's paid for and all they have to do is perform their talents and they get to hobnob with high society as well. So it's kind of this weird win-win for both of them, but obviously it doesn't. A lot of people say it doesn't really work that way because the more businessmen you let in, these are not artistic minds. These are dull men of numbers and power and all these other things.
Yeah,
so
I think we should definitely talk about the irony of that a little bit later on. This is a good passage from Domhoff about that. He writes, solving the financial problems of the club, as he said, had its price, of course. In 1880, only 8 years after its founding, a group of painters and writers protested that the present day is not as the past days. The salt has been washed out of the club by commercialism. The chairs are too easy and the food too dainty, and the true bohemian spirit has departed. Around the turn of the century, one early member anonymously decried this change in spirit in a little booklet on, quote-unquote, early Bohemia. The entering of the money social element has not benefited the club as a bohemian club, he claimed. Now the club had social aspirations, which means death to genius and a general dead-level mediocrity. Elsewhere, he noted, in the beginning, rich men were absolutely barred unless they had something of the elements of true bohemianism, could do something. Now they get in because they are rich. And this actually apparently caused tensions. And it says the tension which sometimes flared between the rich and the talented members was also experienced by the most famous artist member of the 1880s, Jules Tavernier. Tavernier became so annoyed at one point that he drew an extra cartoon for a Jinx night, which he displayed in the clubhouse without the permission of the Jinx committee. It was an allegorical cartoon, reminisced a longtime member in 1907, the artist's idea being, Bohemia is fallen into the hands of the bourgeois. Weaving spiders have spun their nets over Bohemia's halls. The owl has taken flight from Bohemia. In effect, the cartoon represented a Bohemia where trade and barter were followed, and where there were money changers, as in the temple. This unexpected addition to the evening's entertainment greatly offended many wealthy members, which is said to have pleased Tavernier greatly. Usually the cartoons painted by artist members were hung on the walls, but Tavernier took this one away at the end of the evening, proudly announcing that it was too good for the bourgeois.
Well, I mean, so you do see there, it's a little more complicated than just like they're all death worshiping, like German death cult worshippers, like from the very beginning.
Gotten even worse, like over time. I think that's even very early on, like in the 1880s.
That was like, 8 years into it. I'm sorry, it wasn't even a decade or two. It was like
already he was like the weaving spiders have taken over. They have.
I mean, really ain't nothing new under the sun with artists having to go like sing for their supper and hold their hand out to have the people with money basically sustain their careers, or like you know what I mean? Like it's still today, like the idea of like an artist doing something like pisses off like wealthy museum donors or like benefactors or something. Mm-hmm. Like you could still see that dynamic play out, and it's almost like gauche to talk about, you know what I mean? Because everybody's like, how else do you make money as like an artist? So
and it's funny because now it's become like like its artistic tastes are still like incredible. Like they're still doing these types of like weird pageants that are like sort of like a mix between like Elizabethan mass and like USO shows that are like just these bizarre
it really is.
things.
I'm pretty sure Bob Hope was a member.
Well, yeah, like that's like the type of artist who would like be a member. Like they
preferred
like
Bing Crosby.
I guess. Yeah, Bing Crosby was a member, right? Yeah. But like they even like I know you definitely brought up like your suspicions of modern art based on the CIA funding, but like even modern art was like banned from the Bohemian Grove.
Yeah, in the 1920s it was banned. Yeah. Right. Well, because modern art was actually dope and had like social content, so they had to like spend a few decades like to find some alcoholic in New England that just threw paint at a canvas. I guess
fine,
you're
thinking
fine.
of like 50s era like Rothko and so like
that
not,
quote
like,
was specifically
Cubism.
Exactly. I mean, once you got to the 50s and the 60s, all those same exact
Picasso
people
was much more political than
Picasso was like
Rothko.
technically speaking a communist, and like so was Diego Rivera and like Frida.
Very political painting.
Most of those people
you definitely
were.
Wouldn't want Guernica at the Bohemian Grove for sure.
Yeah, I remember when Diego Rivera painted like a Lenin mural on Rockefeller Center, and they were like it's that like I think that's kind of the thing maybe they were like rebelling against. And then like once like Rothko and Pollock came out, they were like, well, our friends have funded this, so we've done the studies, and this will help our cause basically.
For access to the full-length episode, subscribe to the Hour of Frequency at patreon.com/subliminaljihad.
The darkness sacrificed some occult experts. It becomes clear. It is a mixture of the Babylonian Canaanite cult of Moloch fused with ancient druidic rites, where you have the female side of Satan, which they first call out to in the she, mixed with Masonic rites from Scotland.